The cold stone walls of Rouen fortress closed in on her, lit by the flicker of torches. Joan of Arc, the 19-year-old peasant girl who had commanded armies and crowned a king, now sat in chains. Her enemies called her witch, heretic, sorceress. But beneath these accusations lay something deeper, something more dangerous than any charge of magic. They feared her because she was a woman who had stepped outside the boundaries of her age. The trial of Joan of Arc was not simply about faith or politics. It was about power and how gender could be turned into a weapon sharper than any sword. Joan had risen from obscurity, claiming visions from God that told her to drive the English from France. She wore armor, rode at the head of troops, and spoke to nobles as an equal. For medieval society, this was unthinkable. Women were expected to be silent, obedient, and cloistered within their homes or convents. Yet here was a young woman who dressed as a man, commanded soldiers, and defied every expectation placed upon her sex. To her enemies, this was more than rebellion. It was heresy against the natural order itself. And so, when they finally captured her in 1430, they built a case designed not only to destroy her but to humiliate her. The courtroom was not a fair one. It was a stage. Over 70 judges and clerics, most loyal to England, gathered to interrogate a single uneducated girl. But Joan was no ordinary prisoner. Day after day, she faced them with calm and courage, outwitting their questions, refusing to betray her visions. The judges first attacked her visions, claiming they were demons in disguise. But when Joan held firm, they shifted to something far more personal: her clothing. Joan had long worn men's attire: tunic, boots, hose, and short hair. She said it was for protection in the rough world of soldiers and camps. But her enemies saw an opening. In medieval law, cross-dressing could be considered a grave sin if done with pride or defiance. They framed it as proof of rebellion against both God and nature. Joan's attire became central to her trial. The judges grilled her. Why did she wear men's clothing? Would she return to women's dress? Joan replied that she wore what God commanded, that her clothes kept her safe from assault among hostile guards, and that she would not abandon them without divine permission. This simple act, wearing armor, riding like a knight, was twisted into evidence of wickedness. But the deeper strategy was humiliation. Joan's enemies wanted to strip her not only of life, but of dignity. Her gender became the tool of her destruction. Chroniclers note how English soldiers mocked her openly, calling her names unfit to speak in court. In prison, she was denied the security normally given to female captives. Instead of being kept by nuns, she was guarded by male soldiers who threatened her constantly. Even the clothing charge was designed to set a trap. If Joan wore men's dress, she was sinning. If she switched to women's dress, her guards could more easily assault her. Either way, they could accuse her of disobedience to the church's commands. After months of interrogation, Joan's strength began to falter. Isolated, ill, and afraid of torture, she eventually signed an abjuration, a document admitting her supposed errors. She agreed to wear women's clothing. For a brief moment, it seemed she might be spared. But the English were not satisfied. They needed her destroyed. Soon after, Joan was found again in male clothing. Some sources suggest her guards stole her dress and left her only men's garments to wear. Others say she willingly returned to them, claiming that without her soldier's garb, she was vulnerable to assault. Either way, this relapse was exactly what her judges needed. They condemned her as a relapsed heretic, and the sentence was death. But beyond the legal trap, there was something deeper: a medieval obsession with controlling women who defied norms. Joan was not the first to face such attacks. Across Europe, women who claimed spiritual authority, who preached without permission, or who stepped outside prescribed roles often faced accusations of sorcery, heresy, or immorality. For Joan, every part of her identity was weaponized against her. Her short hair was called a mark of pride. Her armor was called a sign of rebellion. Her visions, which inspired thousands, were mocked as lies of the devil. And yet, through it all, Joan never wavered in her belief. Even facing execution, she declared her visions true and her mission holy. Eyewitnesses described her courage as she was led to the stake in Rouen marketplace on May 30th, 1431. Tied to the post, flames rising around her, she called on Jesus with her final breath. In that moment, her enemies thought they had erased her. But they only made her immortal. Within 25 years, even the church admitted her trial was corrupt. The same institution that condemned her later declared her innocent. And centuries later, she would be canonized as a saint. But the story of her trial reveals something chilling about medieval justice. Joan was not simply killed for her faith. She was destroyed because she crossed gender boundaries in a world that saw such defiance as intolerable. Her trial shows how accusations of immorality, cross-dressing, and disobedience were used to control and punish women who stepped beyond their assigned roles. This was more than a personal vendetta. It was a pattern seen throughout the late Middle Ages, the rise of witch hunts in the 15th and 16th centuries would use the same tactics. Accusations of heresy laced with sexual slander, humiliating public punishments, and trials designed to break women's spirits as much as their bodies. Joan's trial was a warning to all who might follow her path. Women must not claim authority, and those who do will be shamed, crushed, and burned as examples. The fortress of Rouen still stands today. Walk its halls, and you can almost hear the echo of chains, the murmur of judges, and the steady, unshaken voice of a 19-year-old girl who dared to challenge her world. Joan's courage still burns brighter than the flames that tried to silence her. Yet to truly understand why Joan's enemies were so determined to destroy her, we must step back and look at the larger world she lived in. This was an age of war and fear. The 100 Years' War had ravaged France for decades, leaving fields in ruin and peasants desperate. Armies pillaged villages, famine stalked the land, and people searched for signs from heaven. In this climate, any hint of divine guidance could inspire hope or suspicion. When Joan appeared, claiming to hear the voices of saints urging her to lead France, she was first met with doubt. But her boldness and apparent divine favor, victories in battle, the coronation of Charles VII, made her a symbol of French resistance. For the English and their Burgundian allies, she became a threat not just militarily but spiritually. If God truly spoke through this peasant girl, then their cause was doomed. They needed to destroy her both as a soldier and as a symbol. And so they attacked her in the place medieval society left most vulnerable, her womanhood. Her courage in battle was twisted into arrogance. Her chastity was mocked, despite the fact she swore a vow of virginity and lived it faithfully. Even this purity, which should have been honored in a Christian culture, was used against her. To them, a woman who refused male control, even in her own household, even in choosing not to marry, was dangerous. As the trial unfolded, one detail stood out to observers. Joan, an illiterate peasant, argued theology with trained scholars and often bested them. She refused to swear blanket obedience to the court unless she knew the questions in advance, an astonishing move for the time. She said her ultimate obedience was to God, not to men who misused their power. This quiet defiance enraged her judges as much as any military victory. The image of Joan in her cell, young, chained, guarded by hostile men, captures the heart of her story. She was condemned not because of sorcery or treason, but because she showed that a woman could lead, command respect, and act with divine authority. In a world ruled by men, that was a crime beyond forgiveness. Her trial moved toward a predetermined conclusion. But Joan never gave her accusers the submission they craved. They wanted her to admit her visions were false, her armor a disguise for sin, her male dress an act of depravity. She refused. She told them plainly. She wore male dress to protect herself among soldiers. She followed God's voice, not man's. And yet, in that refusal lay the threat. Because if a young woman could claim divine authority without a bishop's blessing, what power did the church really hold over anyone? They tried to trick her with questions meant to trap her. One infamous exchange still echoes across the centuries. "Are you in God's grace?" they asked. It was a cunning trap. If she said yes, she'd be accused of arrogance. Only priests claimed to know such things. If she said no, she'd be condemned as a sinner unworthy of her mission. Joan replied with brilliance that silenced the room. If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God keep me there. A 19-year-old farm girl, without schooling, outwitted men who had spent their lives in university halls. But the verdict was written long before her answers. The charge sheet spoke of sorcery, heresy, and, most damning of all, her refusal to conform to the role of woman as they defined it. The robe and sword were not just military tools. They were seen as rebellion against the very order of society. She was threatened with torture in the dungeons of Rouen. The men who presided over her trial ordered the rack prepared. Though records suggest they never went through with it, the threat itself was enough to haunt her. They hoped to terrify her into recanting, or worse, into confessing to crimes she never committed. The prison itself was designed to humiliate. Unlike male prisoners of war, Joan was denied captivity in a church prison guarded by women or clergy. Instead, she was kept under the watch of English soldiers who mocked her, sometimes even threatened her with assault. This was deliberate. It was not enough to condemn her. They needed to break her spirit, to make her an example of what happened to women who defied their station. When she briefly signed a paper, a so-called abjuration, under the shadow of execution, they seized on it. They claimed she had confessed to her sins, though no one could agree on what those sins were. But Joan would not stay broken. Within days, she returned to her male dress, likely because it was her only defense against the soldiers in her cell. And for this, they declared her a relapsed heretic, sealing her fate. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led through the streets of Rouen. The crowd gathered not just to see a prisoner die, but to witness a public lesson. This is what happens when a young woman refuses to obey men. This is what happens when you claim your own voice speaks with God's authority. Eyewitnesses describe her calm. They say she asked for a cross to hold as the flames were lit. An English soldier, moved to pity, made a small cross out of sticks and handed it to her. A sympathetic priest raised the processional cross high so she could see it. Even her enemies recorded that she died crying the name of Jesus. When the fire died down, her accusers ordered her body burned twice more, to ensure no relic could be taken, no symbol of sainthood could survive. They even scattered her ashes into the Seine. It was not enough to silence her voice. They wanted to erase her memory. But history has a way of defying those who try to control it. 25 years later, the same church that condemned her as a witch declared her trial invalid. Centuries after that, the girl they branded a heretic was canonized as a saint. Joan's story is often told as a tale of simple faith and military courage. But it is also a story of how power uses gender as a weapon. Her trial records show obsession with her body, her clothing, her behavior as a woman. She was attacked not just for fighting the English, but for daring to exist outside the narrow cage built for her sex. The men who judged her wanted to turn her body into proof of sin. The clothes she wore became evidence of guilt. Her very voice, calm, clear, unwavering, was treated as rebellion against God, because it did not submit to theirs. In truth, Joan of Arc was not destroyed by fire. The flames consumed her flesh, yes, but they could not erase her defiance, or the fear she planted in the hearts of powerful men. Even now, 6 centuries later, her story still unsettles, because it asks questions we are still wrestling with today. Who has the right to speak with authority? Who decides which voices are heard and which are silenced? And how often is gender used as a weapon not only to punish but to control? Joan's trial reminds us that history is not just about battles and kings. It's about people, frightened, ambitious, vindictive people, using every tool at their disposal to cling to power. And sometimes that tool is shame. Sometimes it's fear of the female body. Sometimes it's the determination to remind the world, you will obey or you will burn. Yet Joan never obeyed. Even chained in a cell, even facing the stake, she never stopped saying that her voices came from God, not men. In that defiance lies her true victory. She did not live to see it, but she became a symbol not just of French resistance, but of every person told they do not belong in armor, in leadership, in history itself. Joan of Arc walked into the fire still believing she was chosen. And in a way, she was right. Because even as the smoke rose over Rouen, her story refused to die. Her judges thought they were silencing a girl. Instead, they created a legend. And legends, unlike bodies, do not burn.